Imagine South Africa in the 1980s. White Brits and Dutch strutted around, while black South Africans carried the nation on their backs, and the world screamed apartheid. Now imagine Japan, but swap the Brits for Korean aristocrats, the Dutch for Chinese landowners, and the oppressed for Jomon, Ainu, and Micronesians. Voila, same story, different costumes. Only difference, South Africa confessed. Japan. Oh no, Japan is still playing the "we are pure, isolated, homogenous Yamato race" karaoke track on repeat. See, the joke is, South Africa got sanctioned, humiliated, dragged through the UN, and eventually admitted their dirty laundry. Japan, they're still spraying air freshener over a century-old garbage pile, smiling politely and pretending no one notices the stench. Spoiler, we do. So today let's unpack this comedy of denial. Because, and I say this with love, if South Africa was apartheid with subtitles, Japan is apartheid with anime filters. Let's clear the smokescreen right away. Japan loves to tell the world, we are the pure Yamato race, 2,000 years unbroken, descended from the sun goddess herself. Beautiful marketing, right? Except it's complete nonsense. The truth is way messier and honestly way funnier. The Jomon were the original inhabitants of the islands, hunter-gatherers, pottery makers, and genetically connected to Micronesians and Filipinos. Yes, that's right. Japan's deep ancestors weren't elegant Kyoto courtiers sipping tea under cherry blossoms. They were much closer to the people you'd meet in Guam, Palau, or Manila. Brown-skinned, seafaring, tropical lineage. The island cousins Japan desperately doesn't want on the family tree. Then came the Yayoi, arriving around 300 BCE. These were migrants from the Korean peninsula and parts of coastal China, bringing rice farming, metallurgy, and a rather inflated sense of superiority. Think of it as a hostile corporate takeover. New management flies in, tells the locals they've been doing culture wrong, and sets up a new hierarchy. Within a few centuries, aristocratic lineages formed. And guess what? The top seats went to Yayoi elites with Korean and Chinese bloodlines. So when Japan says, we are homogenous, what they actually mean is, we erased the Jomon, sidelined the Ainu, evicted Okinawans, and buried Micronesian ancestry under 50 layers of denial. The ruling classes were Yayoi, Chinese landlords and Korean aristocrats, while the Jomon descendants were pushed into the shadows. In other words, Japan's entire pure race myth is about as real as anime high school uniforms. The Jomon are Micronesian and Filipino cousins, the Yayoi were imports from Korea and China, and the apartheid-style hierarchy was baked in from the very beginning. South Africa had Brits and Dutch. Japan had Chinese and Koreans. Different continents, same script. Now, let's assign everyone their apartheid roles, shall we? If this was South Africa, the Koreans would be the Brits, arriving first with their aristocratic airs, quickly claiming the crown, and writing the national myth in their own handwriting. That imperial family Japan worships as pure Yamato blood. Surprise! It's Korean aristocracy and cosplay, the Brits of Asia lording over the new colony with divine legitimacy. Next in the cast, the Chinese. Think of them as the Dutch settlers, not always on the throne but deeply embedded in the mid-tier. Landowners, merchants, cultural importers. Hiroshima, Tottori, and much of the Chūgoku region literally carried Chinese lineages like a genetic watermark. These weren't the samurai aristocrats, but they owned enough rice paddies and villages to keep themselves comfortably above the local Jomon masses. And then the Jomon, the original islanders, connected to Micronesians and Filipinos. They're the South African blacks and coloureds in this story. The people whose land it was to begin with, suddenly demoted to the bottom of a new racial ladder. Pushed into the mountains, erased from the textbooks, only remembered when Japan needs a primitive pottery exhibit at the museum. Sound familiar? This is why the comparison stings. South Africa admitted it had apartheid. The Brits and Dutch ruled while blacks were systematically marginalized. Japan, on the other hand, is still humming the homogenous Yamato race lullaby, pretending the Jomon just disappeared. Poof! As if history is a Studio Ghibli fantasy where inconvenient ethnicities fade into mist. The joke. South Africa got sanctions, boycotts, and a global slap in the face. Japan got UNESCO World Heritage status for Yayoi rice fields. One faced reality, the other sells denial and glossy tourist brochures. Different continents, identical script. So how did this hierarchy actually look on the ground? Imagine Kyoto's aristocratic court. Silk robes, poetry, and endless rituals of superiority. That was the Korean-descended aristocracy, the Brits of Japan, sipping sake while convincing everyone they were literal descendants of the gods. No one could challenge them because they rewrote history itself. We are the chosen, the Yamato race. Translation: we got here last, but we're in charge. Meanwhile, the Chinese-descended lineages, the Dutch class, weren't sitting on thrones, but they didn't need to. They controlled the rice paddies, the trade, the mid-tier power structure. Look around Hiroshima, Tottori, or the Chūgoku region, and you'll find their fingerprints everywhere. If the Koreans were busy cosplaying as emperors, the Chinese migrants were busy collecting rent. And at the bottom, the Jomon descendants, the Micronesian Filipino bloodline. They became Japan's black and coloured population, pushed into fishing villages, mountain corners, or outright erased. The Ainu in the north, Okinawans in the south, and hidden Jomon bloodlines scattered across the islands. Their fate was to be labelled primitive, while the Yayoi elites called themselves civilized. Classic apartheid logic. Now here's the punchline. South Africa dismantled apartheid in the 1990s. Japan? Fast forward to 2025 and the structure hasn't really changed. The so-called imperial line is still Korean in origin. The mid-tier ruling elite still reflects Chinese-descended landowners. And the Jomon? They're still marginalized. Okinawans and Ainu remain politically invisible. Micronesians, Filipinos, and other minorities are treated like second-class citizens, or worse, denied altogether. Japan keeps insisting it's one homogeneous race, which is like South Africa in the 1980s saying, "What apartheid? We're all just one big family." The only difference? South Africa was forced to admit its system to the world. Japan has mastered the art of denial. Different costumes, identical hierarchy, still alive and well in 2025. Fast forward to Tokyo in 2025. You don't need a DNA test to see the hierarchy. Just take a stroll through Ginza. The women smiling from luxury ads, pouring whiskey in upscale hostess bars, or appearing in glossy magazines. Their faces lean toward the refined look of Yayoi heritage. Sharp chins, fairer skin, straighter features. And what does Yayoi heritage mean? Chinese and Korean bloodlines. The descendants of the aristocrats and landowners still monopolize beauty standards and visibility, just like their ancestors monopolized rice and political power. Now take a detour into the construction sites, sanitation depots, or waste management yards. The face is there, broader, darker, with features Japan politely calls unrefined. In plainer English, Micronesian and Filipino-descended Jomon blood. These are the descendants of the people who built the islands, now still carrying the literal weight of the nation. Digging, hauling, and cleaning while the Yayoi elite sip champagne in Ginza. Apartheid logic, 21st century edition. And it's not just class or gender. Even politics wears this mask. Look at recent prime ministers, Kishida, Ishiba, and their cohort. Commentators often note their typical Yayoi appearance, meaning, again, Chinese-Korean lineage. The upper echelons of Japanese politics remain dominated by those same imported aristocratic features, while the Jomon descendants are nowhere near the diet benches. You don't see an Ainu prime minister. You don't see an Okinawan prime minister. You see Yayoi after Yayoi, recycled with different slogans. So yes, South Africa's apartheid signs once said whites only. Japan doesn't need signs. It's written on the faces. The glossy Ginza hostess, the prime minister on TV, the construction worker hauling trash. They all tell the story of who got crowned and who got crushed. And just like in the Yayoi takeover 2,000 years ago, the script hasn't changed. If Japan really were the pure, unbroken Yamato race, you'd expect their geography to play along, right? But no, the map itself is a snitch. Let's start with the Chūgoku region, covering Hiroshima, Tottori, and Yamaguchi. Notice something? It's literally called Chūgoku, the exact same characters used for China, Zhongguo. That's not poetic coincidence. That's a giant neon sign screaming, Chinese settlers lived here. And surprise, the landowner class that emerged from this region carried Chinese lineage, passing it down generation after generation. The name isn't cultural theft, it's cultural confession. Now move east toward Kansai, between Osaka and Kyoto. Welcome to Nara, cradle of Japan's first imperial capital, the place Japanese schoolbooks romanticize as the birth of high civilization. But here's the linguistic punchline. Nara in Korean literally means country. That's right. Japan's most Japanese historical capital carries a Korean name, and the entire aristocratic system that grew out of it was founded by Korean-descended lineages. You can call it Nara, you can build temples there, you can wrap it in UNESCO World Heritage status. But the etymology is Korean, and the bloodline is Korean. So when Japan insists it is unique and isolated, the geography itself disagrees. Hiroshima's region is labeled after China. Nara's name is Korean for country. That's like apartheid South Africa naming its capital Zulu City, and still insisting the Zulu had nothing to do with it. The evidence is baked into the landscape. Japan just hopes no one outside notices, because the domestic population has been carefully trained not to question it. But here's the bitter comedy. It's 2025, and the structure hasn't shifted. The Korean Brits still hold imperial legitimacy. The Chinese Dutch still echo in mid-tier elites, and the Jomon descendants are still the erased laboring class. Japan can spray perfume on it, but the map and the names still reek of history. Japan loves to sell itself as a nation of wa, harmony, consensus, everyone in the same boat rowing politely toward the future. And abroad, people eat it up. Anime exports harmony, sushi exports harmony, even the Olympics tried to export harmony. Remember the 2020 Tokyo Games slogan, United by Emotion? Cute, right? But here's the gag. That harmony is just apartheid with a kimono on. The structure we traced from the Yayoi takeover never disappeared. It just put on slicker packaging. The imperial line? Still Korean aristocracy in disguise. The mid-tier elites? Still echoing Chinese landowners from Chūgoku. And the Jomon descendants? Still relegated to the bottom. Okinawans, Ainu, and anyone with Micronesian or Filipino blood are treated as an inconvenient footnote. That's not harmony. That's selective visibility. South Africa at least had the decency to admit apartheid existed and dismantle it in the 1990s. Japan? In 2025, it's still running the same system but rebranded as cultural homogeneity. The international community claps, tourists snap selfies under Torii gates, and no one asks why the so-called homogeneous Yamato race still somehow divides neatly into Ginza faces and garbage truck faces. Here's the punchline. Apartheid was a system of laws in South Africa. In Japan, it's a system of denial. The law doesn't say Jomon to the back, but society whispers it every day, in hiring, in politics, in who gets to represent the nation's beauty, and in who gets erased from the story. Different continent, identical structure, only difference. Japan has mastered denial as an art form, like origami folding over centuries of inconvenient truth. So the next time you hear Japan is harmonious, remember, it's not harmony. It's apartheid with anime filters, still running strong in 2025. So let's review. South Africa had Brits and Dutch on top, blacks and coloureds on the bottom. They called it apartheid, the world condemned it, and eventually it collapsed. Japan had Korean aristocrats and Chinese landowners on top, Jomon Micronesians and Filipinos on the bottom. They called it harmony, the world believed it. And here we are in 2025. Same hierarchy, different name. Walk through Ginza, and you'll see the Yayoi faces of Chinese and Korean descent celebrated as the nation's ideal. Walk past a construction site, and you'll see Jomon bloodlines hauling steel beams. Look at the Prime Minister, and you'll see Yayoi features recycled from one leader to the next. And yet, Japan will tell you with a straight face, we are one homogeneous Yamato race. Sure, and sushi is a health food, right? Here's the truth. Japan never ended its apartheid. It just learned how to Photoshop it. South Africa had segregation signs. Japan has denial in textbooks. South Africa faced sanctions. Japan gets tourism awards. South Africa was shamed into change. Japan turned its apartheid into a marketing strategy. And that's the genius and the tragedy. Because the world claps for Japan's uniqueness, never realizing it's just the same old hierarchy with sakura petals sprinkled on top. Different continent, identical system. South Africa confessed. Japan is still lying. So next time someone gushes about Japan's harmony, just smile and say, ah yes, apartheid with anime filters, very kawaii.